All right. I'm going to show you in this video how to look at an experiment. And we're continuing with this running example of trying to understand what predicts burnout. And in the other two studies, or the other two videos, I showed you how to interpret a meta-analysis, how to interpret a longitudinal study. Now let's imagine that we want to understand potential interventions that could decrease the burnout that we see in employees. In the running example, we have the claims adjusters. We're trying to reduce burnout amongst claims adjusters. From my searching process, I found that there weren't that many studies that were experiments. But with relaxing my terms, I was able to find an experiment that I ultimately decided to include, even though the population is about frontline workers. And specifically, we have social workers, nurses, correctional officers, yada, yada, that in an ideal world, we would have an experiment where the population wasn't so specific and maybe was about industry rather than government agencies, which might have, their own unique considerations. But because there weren't that many studies that I could use, I decided to relax my search terms so that I could see one way to improve burnout that might be applicable for my particular type of organization and my type of population of claims adjusters. We do see here this emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and low personal accomplishments of burnout. That's good. That's in line with what we've been seeing before. And I would recommend when you're looking at an experiment that you read the abstract, like all the other types of studies that you find. The abstract is definitely worth reading because it summarizes what you will see. So we see that they have causal evidence on strategies to reduce burnout. That's great because none of our other studies were causal. They do this multi-city field experiment. That means that they had real people that were involved in an experiment. This is one of the best types of study designs, actually, which is why ultimately I would include this study if I found it, if this was my research topic. They did multiple cities. So even though they have a specific population of frontline workers, at least they are frontline workers. This isn't a laboratory experiment, and they found people across a bunch of different areas as well. They say that they have this 6-week intervention that prompts dispatchers to share advice anonymously and asynchronously with their peers in other cities, and that this is able to reduce burnout by 8 points. We don't know out of what yet, but 0.4 standard deviations. That's pretty good. That's a decent change for an intervention. And in fact, that it cuts resignations by more than half. Also pretty good. Okay. They say that the intervention operates by increasing perceived social support and belonging in an online laboratory experiment. Great. All right. Sounds relevant. So we've made sure that it's about burnout. We've read this intervention. Sounds really interesting. We know that it's a different population, different organizational context, but we'll see if this is worth it and continue on with our interpretation. I would recommend for a study like this, where they have an intervention and they have evidence of cause and effect, like with all your studies, to skim the introduction and see if it's relevant. In this case, this study, I do find this to be particularly relevant because they're talking about the reasons why, or potential mechanisms that can explain why burnout exists and how you can reduce it. So it kind of gives you an idea of what it is they're looking at. All right. So we keep going, we're reading, we're skimming. And we also see, as we keep going along, that they mention this job demands resource model again. So we've seen this now 3 times. This suggests that this is a relevant model for us. We might even decide to include it in our rapid evidence review because it's been discussed so many times. It can help us make sense of the phenomena of burnout. It can help us with kind of our definition of burnout. This isn't going to give us a definition of burnout, but it explains how it works. The model explains what gives rise to burnout. The definition of burnout is what we've been seeing before, where we have emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and low personal accomplishment. But the model tells us why certain things are supposed to give rise to burnout. And this can help us understand how to reduce burnout. So here again, we see this buffering hypothesis. We also see this temporal thing coming up again, where we're talking about how, there's this time element that the resources of today will buffer for, burnout for tomorrow. That makes sense. But we also see that burnout is a chronic phenomenon that develops over time. Again, that aligns with that other study that we looked at, the longitudinal study. So we're starting to fill in the puzzle, put in the pieces to this puzzle. Now they kind of start going into how you would prevent burnout. So they're talking about social support and connecting it to this model, this job demands resource model. And they're explaining why social support would be able to decrease burnout. So this is all really good, important information. I would read all of this. One thing that I would also look at, because our population is different here, I think it's helpful to learn a little bit more about what they say about the participants, about the setting. They do a nice job explaining this here. And in this little section where they explain these dispatchers, this would be one reason why, if I was a claims adjuster manager and I wanted to know about burnout, I would actually include this, because of the job itself. They're describing this is an inherently stressful job. They looked at dispatchers for 911. They answer a ton of calls. They make big decisions in minutes and manage these emotions, and they have to act quickly. This actually sounds a lot like the claims adjusters. It's not exactly like the claims adjusters, but in many ways, there are a lot of similarities. And that, as a result, leads me to believe that this, even though it's about kind of government agency frontline workers, that these employees probably have more in common with the claims adjusters than a study about burnout among accountants. All right. The other thing you want to look for in an experiment like this is describing how they come up with this intervention and what they do. They gather some data before the intervention. It sounds like that's helpful to know about. And then they explain their experimental design. Their experimental design is the intervention. This is what they did to see if they could decrease burnout. The beauty of this study is that they randomized people into a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group got the intervention that is supposed to reduce burnout. Here they describe it. They have 6 emails that are sent from a supervisor or department leader, and they ask everyone in the email, well, there's 2 parts of it apparently that are designed to improve social support. A story from a dispatcher is sent to kind of, it sounds like increased camaraderie in the sense of, you're not alone out there. And then there's a prompt that encourages workers to reflect on and share a positive professional experience to which their peers may relate. So again, kind of improving the social support component of what otherwise might be kind of an alienating job where you're off on your own dealing with all these angry people all the time. Then they explain the control group. These are the people who did not get the intervention. And they have some other type of email that has the opportunity to share stories if they choose, but no additional prompts. So it's not about the social support component of it. It's just like, hey, share a story. This is actually really, really good design, because they're still getting they're still getting an email from their supervisor. So we know it's not some sort of kind of placebo effect where something different is happening, but rather it's the fact that the emails in the intervention, the experimental group, that they call for social support. They call for stories where they kind of have this camaraderie and share positive stories and hear from other dispatchers what their stories are. That's really good. Now I would look for the outcome variable. They're measuring burnout. They're using a different index. That's okay. There's usually going to be a lot of different types of studies or types of measures, but it's important for us in order to interpret our findings to know how they measured it. In this case, they create this composite index ranging from 0 to 100. And so this means that they get these 19 questions and they have a scoring from, yes, this describes me, this doesn't describe me, yes, I feel emotionally exhausted, no, I don't feel emotionally exhausted. And then they just add up all those responses such that if you said, yes, I feel extremely emotionally exhausted as one of these 19 questions, that would probably mean that you got like a score of 7 for that question and for all the other 18 questions, and you would add those up, and a score of 100 means you're the most burned out. A score of 0 means you're the least burned out. I don't know who these people are, but I want to be them. In any case, let's see what they find. Those are the most important pieces of information. As you'll see, we don't really get a correlation matrix in this study. What we have, these are demographics. This is not what we're looking for, but it's interesting. It's good to know, what the ratios are. We see the mean. It looks like, I'm guessing that this is a dummy variable, and 1 means a score of 1 means they're a woman, a score of 0 means they're a male, and that when you take the mean of a dummy score like that, this is essentially a percentage. It says 76% are female. Okay, that's all good and well. So now we're seeing here that they are measuring the effects of their intervention using a regression. This might be kind of like confusing. It's okay if it's a little confusing. Try to sit with that ambiguity and wrestle with it a little bit. You can always ask me questions, but some of it just might be, okay, let me read what they're actually saying here, what they're actually doing. This is nice because they explain it in a way that's pretty, I would say, accessible. So for each outcome, they estimate the following equation. This is your regression coefficient. This means for people who are in the treatment group, how different are they on your outcome variable? This beta weight will give you a number that says, for those who are in the treatment group, this is how much their outcome variable changes by compared to those who are in the control group. And they kind of go into more explanation here. I wouldn't worry that much about some of this other stuff because we're just looking for one effect. We don't need to worry that much about this city waiting and da-da-da. That's good that they did that. The nerds of the world will be happy that they were very statistically precise. But for us, we just want to know how this affects burnout in kind of a high level. Table 2 explains these results a little bit. I wouldn't actually worry that much about table 2 right now. What I would do is read this explanation of table 2, what they did. So immediately, this is kind of written in a way that's a little more accessible than the table. Immediately after the email was sent, treated employees reported lower burnout, although the differences were not statistically significant in panel A. So we go down to panel A. This is their levels of burnout, which we can tell they're measuring. This is the outcome variables, burnout. And this is their levels of burnout after the emails are sent. So right after the emails are sent. If you're ever not sure, you can always look down here again and you can read this note and try to make sense of this. OLS coefficient regression, that means coefficient estimates. That means this is ordinary least square regression. It's just your basic regression. That's all OLS means. And the dependent variable is the burnout score. Either overall, this is total burnout, that would be what I would be interested in, or there's different facets of burnout. I wouldn't worry that much about that. We see the burnout scores range from 0 to 100, and panel A is the scores immediately after the final email was sent. Panel B, 4 months after the final email was sent. So that's kind of interesting because actually, as we'll see here, this row is the effect of the treatment on burnout. That's your beta weight, your regression coefficient on burnout. And none of these are statistically significant, which we can tell because of this key down here that says when things are statistically significant. Oftentimes we have the stars will indicate when something is statistically significant. So here we see these stars or asterisks. That says it's statistically significant at the 0.05 level. In this case, none of these are statistically significant after the treatment. So this means for people who were in the treatment, their burnout scores decreased by 5.82, but we can't tell if that is statistically significantly different from 0. Okay. So that's going back to this, what that 0.5 or that 5.82 is the beta weight. It's the change in Y based on being in the treatment group. But these are not, we can't distinguish these from 0. They're indistinguishable from chance or coincidence. We don't know that that's a quote unquote real effect. However, what we see is that if we let the kind of treatment settle a little bit, so 4 months after the emails were sent, after the treatment was done, we do see a statistically significant effect. It's a little bit stronger. So we see kind of this sort of over time, the treatment takes hold and becomes more pronounced. And we see that for across all measures of burnout, that it's decreasing the score, which remembers from 0 to 100 by 8.38. It's statistically significant. This one is interesting because their regression is the beta weight is indicated as an actual number. It's not standardized. Sometimes they're standardized, sometimes they're not. In this case, we can tell that it's not standardized, which means we're using the raw score of burnout as the outcome variable. It says it here. That's what that means. It will tell you if they're using standardized regression coefficients. And what that means is then we move into, instead of looking at the raw score, we use standard deviations. So that would mean an increase in your X variable would give rise to a certain change in terms of standard deviation in your Y variable. So 1 unit increase in standard deviation of your X equates to a certain change, standard deviation change in your Y. But in our case, these are just raw scores. So it's 0 from 100. Okay, but let's keep reading and understanding what they say here by looking at their actual results section. So here we see they're kind of explaining this a little bit. 6 months after the first email was sent, the intervention was significantly reduced burnout for each of the subcategories. That's panel B, which we just looked at there. And we saw that the effects are large in magnitude and statistically significant. One issue I have is they do have the effect size there for you. They don't say what it is. I'm guessing it's Cohen's d, but they say that it's large. And this is a study that got through peer review. So you can assume that this is a fair way to categorize the practical significance of the effect size. So this part is practical significance, large in magnitude effect, and statistically significant. That those check our 2 boxes for what we're looking for. Then they interpret it a little bit more. We're decreasing burnout by these different point values. Overall, it's by 8 points, and it's about a 0.3 to 0.4 standard deviation change. Okay, so those are what I would look for here. This study is a really well-designed study. They have other pieces of information that you could use. You don't have to because you found, what you needed, what you're looking for. They go into like the mechanisms of social support and all that. That's great. You could use it if you want, but you certainly don't have to. This is, I would say an interesting way to reduce burnout by, a decent amount. They say it's a large effect size, and they were able to even reduce turnover intentions. It sounds like this could be something that could be implemented with the claims adjuster case. And the beauty of this, like all experiments and unlike all the other types of study designs, is that this is a causal relationship. So the only difference between the treatment group and the control group is that they got these emails that asked for social support. Not just that they got emails, but emails that asked for social support. Otherwise, people, as we know from reading the method section, they were randomly assigned. That's a key part of an experimental design. They were randomized. And in fact, actually, they had these matched pairs so that the people that were in the control condition versus the treatment condition, they matched them such that they were pretty similar to one another on a couple of key variables, and then they randomly assigned these matched pairs into each group. You don't need to worry about all that. But the idea here is we have evidence of cause and effect. We know the emails asking for social support are the only difference between these two groups of people, and that this would be a fairly cost-effective way to potentially reduce burnout. If I was a manager working at an insurance company with this problem, I would try to think about how I could implement something like this in my own company.